Good stuff. All right, we're going to start here in just a couple minutes, and we'll get going. If you don't mind checking on Facebook for me, make sure it should be live, should be good. You ready to go? Or another minute it should be. I usually start it just right before. You never know what's going to happen with technology. You can have it all ready to go. Is Paul coming? Is he downstairs? Slacker? Oh, he has Bram? Okay. Excuses. Excuses. We got to have some good Mexican food with Bram the other day. He loves enchiladas. I didn't know that he. Just kidding. He sure is cute. Good morning. Had some of your potatoes last night. Thank you very much for that. They were good. Like, this is so cool. With farmers, they get to have fresh stuff. These eggs just came out of a real chicken and stuff like that. Tons of fun. Any questions about Romans? Anything at all about Romans? Any questions at all? We're going to do a kind of sort of not a quick review, but I mean a little bit. But anything? Good to see you again. It's been a couple weeks. I thank John very much for working hard to study and teaching, and that's on Facebook. If you go to church's Facebook page under videos, there's playlists, and that's a playlist of the anxiety study. Under Romans is there. Every time there's a pastor study, the last 3 pastor studies, they're all there under the same playlist, under a playlist, and so they're easy to get to. So John's is up there, and of course last week Paul, appreciate Paul doing a great job, and we'll pick back up. So we're on Romans 9 through 11. If you're using your handout, it's the bottom of page, well, top of page 3, really. I think we got past all that, didn't we? So, no questions or comments? None. Wasn't here last week, so you want to start all over? Okay. Chapter 1. Kidding. All right, we'll get going. Is that okay? So chapters 9 through 11, and most scholars think, remember, 9 through 11 is one big thought unit. It's a bit difficult sometimes to read it. You need to keep remembering that Paul is having an imaginary conversation with different people. And it'd be nice if Paul said, now to those of you who keep saying, and then he answered. But to you, he doesn't do that. He just says things. And so sometimes in your version of the Bible, it'll say a subtitle. It'll say Paul responds to or something. But that's part of my job too, is to help. But if you keep reading it several times with that in mind, it really does help. It becomes clearer. And this whole section of 9 through 11 is Paul's way of trying to discuss several things. One is, did God forget the Jews since he's come with Christ? No. Later on, he's going to say, well, then what do I do with the fact that a lot of Jews aren't responding? He'll talk about that a lot today. But what about Gentiles? Can they be super happy and think they're all in the good too? Nope. It's all by grace. And so he'll talk about that. And then in chapter 12, he really changes gears a lot. But anyway, so 9 through 11. So chapter 9, I won't go through that backwards. Chapter 10, we'll start in chapter 10. This is where Paul did last week. And just a quick review to get the pumps primed, is that what they call it? And we'll go into verse around 14 later. So Paul starts by saying in chapter 10, he's saying, listen, I am heartbroken that my fellow Jews, and by Jew I mean non-Christian Jew, I'm heartbroken that they have not received Jesus. And it just breaks my heart. It just breaks my heart. So the question is, well then why aren't they responding well? Paul's going to answer that here in a little bit. But then he says, now I'm addressing fellow Jews who come to Paul maybe and go, wait a second. I mean, how do I get this so-called gospel? And he quotes from Deuteronomy. That's in verses 5, 6, and 7. Do I need to ascend? Do I need to descend? This might sound odd to us, but when that was quoted, they were talking about going up to get the law. But by the time of Paul, those verses in Deuteronomy were used speculation about wisdom. So certain Jews were using those verses to say, do I have to go up to the heavens to get God's wisdom? Do I need to get down to the subterranean area to get God's wisdom? Paul's using that idea to say, if you're saying it's like that, where can I get this good news? Paul says, you don't need to do that. You need to go up to heaven. You don't need to go down. You don't need to go searching for it. It's come to you. It's come to you. And that's why he says, verse 8, it's near you. It's near to you. On your lips, your heart. Now, of course, he's quoting almost directly from Deuteronomy 30. He's using the same schema. For a man believes his heart, he confesses with his lips. And that's what he says in Deuteronomy as well. And then he goes on, Paul covered that great job. What about verse 14? Here's another question the Jew might ask, a fellow Jew, and that is to say this. Well, okay, so I don't need to go searching for it, and the heavens are down below, but how do I get access to it? I mean, I've never heard it. That's not fair. And Paul says this. Oh, well, this is the imaginary conversation. Well, what about not believed? What about they never heard? What about those who don't have a preacher? Well, how can someone sent? And his answer to that question is, verse 18. I say, have they not heard? Yes, they have. The point is, there's no excuse. The gospel's not you go searching for it. And what do I do? No one's telling me the gospel. He said, yeah, they have. So Paul's point there is that there's no excuse for you, fellow Jews in his audience. You've heard the gospel. Your lack of receiving the gospel by faith can't be because you don't know it. It's got to be because you're not receiving it. And Paul's not done yet. But if they're not receiving it, why would they not receive it? That is, accept the faith. Paul's about to say, it must be because God has done something to the Jews. And he'll tell you what that is in a second. Does that make sense so far? Yeah? So that seems to be, respectfully, this is why I have never heard this preached well in all my life. I've never heard this preached well because they end with verse 17. Faith comes to hearing for the gospel. Well, first off, you don't have to hear it. Deaf people don't go to hell. That's not the point. He has to say here, because of course he's quoting, right? He's quoting from Psalms and Hosea and Joel and so Isaiah. The point is, it has to be communicated. You have to receive it. Morse code, smoke signals, write it down. It's not the hearing that's the magic pill. That's not the point. But verse 17 usually ends up being the big charge. You need to go share the gospel. Now, and that's true. It's true you ought to go share the gospel. But that's not Paul's point here. Paul's point is this one little section is verse 18, which is there's no excuse. So for you fellow Jews in the congregation, that synagogue, we're going, it's too far out there. No, it's not. It's right here. We've been telling you. Well, no one told me. Yes, they have. Yes, they have. It can't be for those reasons. So that's the whole point is you've already heard it, which is very anticlimactic for your evangelism sermon, isn't it? It's not, go serve. It's like you already heard it. Now, Paul's point isn't every single person on the planet has heard it. He's waxing large. You, my fellow Jews of the time period, you don't have an excuse. And then, he quotes, of course, from Deuteronomy again. Israel has heard the gospel, and that can't be an excuse. It can't be. And he says, Israel not understand? First, Moses says, now this is important in verse 19. He's quoting from Deuteronomy 32, and this matters. Because Deuteronomy 32 becomes his backbone for his argument. Deuteronomy 32:21. Moses says, I will make you, and it's y'all, okay? He means that in the sense of plural, jealous of those who are not a nation. He means Gentile. This is in Deuteronomy, Moses is telling the Israelites, because you're not being faithful, I'm going to make you jealous of those who aren't Jews, who don't have a covenant. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. That means the same thing. I'm going to make you angry. I'm going to make you jealous. I'm going to bless and use people who don't have a covenant with me to make you mad and to make you jealous because you're being so stubborn. That's the point of Deuteronomy 32:21. And Paul says, see, it must be that's what God is doing right now. It must be the case. Look in verse 20. Then Isaiah, he changes gears altogether. Then Isaiah is so bold as to say, I have been found by those who do not seek me. Who would that be? Gentiles. I have shown myself to those who do not ask for me. Gentiles. But of Israel, he says, all day long I've held up my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. Quote from Isaiah 65:2. It's like a father who says, come here, child, and no. Hypothetically, if this ever happened to you parents, you know what I'm talking about. So here, of course, that is the point. So Paul's answer to the question, well, If I don't have to go searching for God's gospel, if I can't excuse because no one told me, that doesn't work, well, then what's going on? Paul's answer is it must be the case that, just like Moses, God said to the Israelites in Deuteronomy 32, that must be happening right now. God wants to use a people group that's not fellow Jews to make the fellow Jews jealous and mad. It's like saying they should be they are thirsty, but they don't want the water God has to give them. But there's some Gentiles and they're just soaking up the fresh rain. It ain't right. We're in the desert. Makes you mad, don't it? We'll go get in the rain. No. If someone just revealed it to me, they did reveal it to you. It's right over there. No one told me about it. Yes, they did. It's right. The rain's right there. It's not right. They're getting all the rain. That's the argument that's the analogy Paul's making. It must be the case that God's letting it rain on someone else so that you go, I need to go over there. To go over there, by analogy, is to get to Jesus. Chapter 11, verse 1, he says, I ask then, has God rejected his people? Of course not. Absolutely not. By no means. I am an Israelite. And you don't see that often, but that Israelite. I am an Israelite. I'm a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin was one of the most respected tribes of Israel. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew, and it is people, plural. Paul's saying, listen, I'm an Israelite, and I've received the gospel. God hasn't rejected me. You just need to receive the gospel. God has not rejected his people, his whole people, people group. Please do not think individuals, think people group, think corporate. Do you not know that the scripture says of Eliah or Elijah how he pleads with God against Israel? This is from 1 Kings 19. Lord, they've killed your prophets. They've demolished your altars. I alone am left, and they seek my life. And what was God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed down knee to Baal. Like Abraham, as it were. So the point is, I have a group of, just a small remnant of people, of all the Jews who haven't given up, they have faith. So too at this present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. That is, like Abraham, back in Romans 4, it's by grace. It's by grace. That is in Jesus as opposed to the Mosaic law. They didn't earn themselves. There's a remnant that also have accepted God's grace. They have not earned it, and that's Paul's. They've not had works of the law. Nope. But if it is by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace should no longer be grace. So even the remnant that's left over is a remnant that God's choosing to work with through the Jews because they've done it because God has given them grace through the gospel. Paul's trying so hard to make this, and I'm probably messing it up, mudding it terribly, but he's trying to say, no matter which way you get at it, you cannot think they're God's chosen people because they've earned it. If they're God's chosen people, it's because it's just an act of grace on God's part, that he continues to use them as a people group. Well, has all Israel, are they all lost? He says, no. Has God forgotten them? No. I'm a Jew. He hasn't forgotten me. But there's got to be a remnant. A remnant. That just means a portion. I wouldn't get caught up in numbers or percentages. It just means a portion. It could be a huge remnant. We don't know. Verse 7. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it sought. I bet those were fighting words in this time period. The problem with all you Jews is you lost. You didn't get what you wanted. The elect obtained it. That is to say, the remnant. But the rest were hardened. And that Greek word's a little different from the previous time he used the word hardened. Made ossified, but it's a similar point. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor. Of course, you quote him, Micah in Deuteronomy 29. A spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see and ears that should not hear, down to this very day. And he quotes from the Psalm 68. And the Psalm says, or he says, and David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a pitfall and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. Okay? Again, one time, let me just paraphrase. Paul seems to be saying, God has not rejected the Jewish people. There is a remnant that God knows there will be a remnant, he will say in a second, that will respond to the gospel. There will be a remnant that will respond to the gospel. They'll respond to the gospel, not earn their way. They will respond to the gospel. Now, but why do all the Jews reject? What's going on? He says it must be the case that God has strengthened their resolve against it, like he did Pharaoh. Pharaoh hardened his heart, meaning Pharaoh's going, no. And this is God hardened his heart, which is saying God's going, that's right. Keep saying no, keep saying no. Why? Just like to Pharaoh, it's to show how great God is. Here he's saying there are a bunch of Israelites going, no, I don't want that rain. I don't want the gospel. And God's going, okay, that's right. Keep saying no, keep saying no. Why would he do that? So that they see those getting the rain and get jealous and eventually break that hard-heartedness and receive the gospel. So he thinks, in some way, in some fashion, helps the Israelites get jealous and mad. Yes? So yeah, you would like to think that God didn't choose the people who would reject him, but rather he just strengthened the resolve. That's exactly my reading. That's exactly my reading too. I don't find anything in there at all that God caused people to reject him. And I think many people, because of respectfully bad teaching and preaching, think that to foreknow means to cause to be. That is not what it means. It's just not what it means. It means God knew there would be a group of people who would say no. And so he strengthened their resolve. But he'll say in a second, does that, well, but David, it sure sounds like he's saying that now we strengthen their resolve forever. No, look what he said. He's going to answer that question too. So forever, is God going to make strengthen their resolve forever? Verse 11, so I ask, have they stumbled so as to fall forever? You might say, no. No, but through their trespass, Psalm 68 again, but through their trespass salvation has come. Sorry, not Psalm 68 again. Sorry. I looked in the wrong part of my Greek. Sorry. Had they stumbled to fall? By no means, but through their trespass salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as then as I'm an apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. That is, I have a voice here. I wish he did this the whole time, Dustin, but he doesn't. Now I'm talking to you Gentiles. Now I'm talking to you, I like that he finally does it. Before you Gentiles think your britches are too big, in order to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what would their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. He's saying, don't give up. Don't you Gentiles get all worked up and think you're all that. It will be so wonderful when this hard-heartedness stops. When they finally get so jealous, they receive the gospel. They finally get so jealous, they receive the gospel. Verse 17, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the richness of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. You hear the metaphor, right? The olive tree is a well-known metaphor for Israel. In fact, there's a synagogue, I think it's in Israel, and it's called the olive tree. That's a well-known thing. So it's a metaphor. You've been grafted. If you do boast, verse 18, if you do boast, remember it's not you that support the root, but the root supports you. You're just a branch, son. You will say, well, branch is broken off so that I might be grafted in. Well, that's true, right? Yeah, that's right. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast only through faith. Do not become proud, but stand in awe. Well, look at us. We arrived. We're in God. We're God's people now, son. Those Jews, they broke off all those remnants. Good for you. Nope, don't do that. Don't do that. Verse 21, why? Because if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Your pride will ruin you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. That will never, oh, I know, I'll start preaching. That doesn't get preached today. It will by me. Note the kindness and the severity. See, no, no, no. Because today God loves you means He fully accepts you, He affirms everything you do. But that's just not biblical. It's just not. It's just not biblical. Note the kindness and the severity of God. Severity to those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you all, provided you all continue in His kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. It's all grace, son. And even the others, if they don't persist in their unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you have been cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into an olive tree? They'll fit right in just perfectly if these Jews will just respond. It's their gospel first. So Gentiles, don't get cocky, don't get proud. And then he says in verse 25, lest you be wise in your own conceits, I want you to understand this mystery, brethren. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles come in. And so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, Isaiah 59, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Yaakov. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. There's Jeremiah 31. So he quotes two different passages. One more time, not to go too fast, verse 25. So this is Paul's answer. Why aren't the Jews coming in full force to respond to the good news of the Messiah? Well, I had to go up to heaven. No, you didn't. Go down low. No, you didn't. No one told me. Yes, they did. It's got to be because when they've heard the gospel, they go, no. They already have a rebellion act, and God's strengthening that resolve to say no. But, Paul says, but the goal of the hardening is not hell. It's not to fall. It's not to fall. He said that. To fall? No. That's not the point. He wants to be rebellious, so that when God blesses all these Gentiles by the gospel, they'll get jealous and angry and go, okay, I've got to respond. I've got to respond. And I will be easily grafted back in. God's not done with you. No, hey, you said no, forget it. If you say no, then you say yes. Come back in. The tree's got plenty of room for the branches. Come back in. It feels great. But what about the end of verse 25 when he says all the Gentiles? And then he says in verse 26, so all Israel will be saved. It's one of the most debated passages in Romans in scholarship. And people have all kinds of answers to that. Does Paul envision every single Jew who's ever lived being saved? Does Paul envision all believing Jews in Christ, all Jewish Christians will be saved? Or does all mean something like a big group of people? Because you can look in many portions of the Old and New Testament where, and this is very common, it's hyperbole. For example, which we'll today in the sermon, Mark 10:45, the Son of Man come not to serve, be served, but to serve as ransom for many. He doesn't mean, handful. It's a way of saying a lot of people. Sometimes it says all, it doesn't mean all. Sometimes it means many. It just depends on the context. You can decide what you think. My own view is, I'm not sure. I don't think, I may be wrong. Paul might envision at the end of time, I don't know, does Paul envision in his lifetime Jesus is returning? So, hey man, in the next few months or few years, all these Jews are finally going to have a change of heart. He might really envision that. He didn't tell us. He might envision. There are times in Paul's letters, like in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, when those of us who are still alive, when he returns, we will be changed in the blinking of an eye and the trump of the sound. And we will all be changed. We will all be. So Paul thinks that Jesus is returning in his lifetime. And you say, well, no, he means we like we Christians. Maybe, but it probably means Paul thinks I will be changed. My body will be changed. Well, if that is Paul's view and that's standard in scholarship, then Paul thinks that in his lifetime, the fellow Jews in the Roman Empire will change their mind, accept the gospel, and they'll be cool. Or does Paul mean might say eschatologically, at the end of time, they will change their mind? Then I would say, if that's true, then I would say, Paul, what about all the Jews between then and that die for centuries? Paul just doesn't tell us. I don't think Paul means That's one thing. What the time period? I'm not sure. I don't know what Paul would say. If I had option, I think it'd be option A. I think Paul thinks in his lifetime. I think. The second thing is, does he mean all, as in every single individual Israelite? My response to this, I don't think Paul means that. I don't think Paul thinks every single individual Israelite, for at least two reasons. One is because I could take you to other places in the Old Testament, uh, not the second, but in the Old Testament and in what we call intertestamental Jewish literature, when it would say all Israel, and they don't mean all Israel, they mean a portion of it. So I think there's a lot of precedent for he means a big chunk. So I don't think he means every one of them because there's literary precedent. The second reason I think he doesn't mean every single Israelite is because I think Paul very much believes through his letters, I see that he means the person has to have faith. And I don't see why Paul would think every single Jew will convert. No more than he thinks every single Gentile will convert. I think Paul does believe that everyone converts. So I think Paul would say, when he says all Israel, I think he means all believing Israel, all those who put their faith in Jesus Israel. But you can read the literature or whatever, make up your own mind. But it's problematic. I mean, as far as I don't know exactly beyond that. Any question or comments about that particular point? Good question. So, do I think at the end God will switch it from hardening their resolve to switch it to encourage them? Yeah, because in the end time, this mass acceptance. Brother, I don't know. I've heard that before, that perhaps the end God will have a big encouragement, like, come on now, come on. In that sense, I don't know of a biblical reason to think that. Maybe I'd be persuaded, though. I'm not saying no. I'm just saying I've never been. So maybe you can find some Bible verses to persuade me that that would occur. I can't think of a reason why. Hmm. So maybe do some more. I'll do some more pondering on that. But at the cuff, I can't think of a reason to think that God will all of a sudden, as it were, give encouragement. Another another thing that's problematic for me is the first point I made, which is about time. So, for example, if we think that God will at the end times be encouragement, I would say then to whom? Those Jews who are alive? Why do they get special treatment? What about for centuries of Jews who were hardened or whatever before and they haven't heard? Does that mean post mortem? So after death they have another chance? There are Christians who argue for post mortem evangelism experience. They do argue that, not for biblical reasons, but for theological reasons, that they've got to have one more chance, or for some, the very first chance. Um, I appreciate that. I don't find that biblically compelling, but maybe at the end of the day, he gets all the Jews together and goes, "Do you see me now?" I mean, can you hear me now? I don't. Yeah, I just don't find that persuasive. I guess at this point, maybe though, maybe though. I always like to think God would do something like that, but to all of us. But see, Paul seems to have this idea. I mean, all through his letters, it seems to me Paul has this idea that if they need to respond to the gospel, well, there's bad news. That's why I tend to think he thinks in his lifetime. Well, yeah, that's the best I got on that. Sorry, man. Good question. Anything else? Good. What up, John? All right. Do you understand what at least what I'm saying? I think Paul's point is. Move ahead. Okay. And then Paul, he ends with going, "Oh, it's a big." Remember, he said it's a mystery. Mystery is apocalyptic language. This mystery a lot of times means something God intends that he has to reveal to us. It's a big heavenly mystery, and now it's been revealed. We see that in Galatians, other places. And that's what he said, this, it must be a mystery. Do you remember that verse 25? And so he's saying God is revealed. And so in Paul's view, God has revealed this to him. This is what's verse 33. Now he throws back of the sense of, oh, who knows? It's all mystery. But oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways. This is full of quotations and allusions to other places. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? The answer is nobody. That's in Job, right? Who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. And so Paul, of course, is saying, man, no one really knows what he's thinking. So he just said, here's the mystery revealed, but no one really knows what he's thinking. But Paul's view is that that's what's going on. And then he changes gears. Now, don't forget, you can imagine Paul in prison, just legit broken, time after time after time, going to synagogues and talking with fellow cousins and siblings and co-workers who are fellow Jews and are like, no, I don't want this gospel. I don't want it. And Paul's like, how can you not? What is wrong with you? Why in the world can't you? What is wrong with you? There's got to, this must be divinely, God must be doing something here. And he goes through his Old Testament, what we call his Bible, goes to Deuteronomy 32 and said, it must be like that. It must be like they're just, God has put an Isaiah, it's there in Isaiah, and that there must be a stupor. Yeah, that's what it is. Somehow God is blinding them to the truth so that they get angry and jealous and go, I want what they've got. And it's got to be that case. Eventually they're going to break that hard-heartedness. Eventually. That's Paul's hope. And then at the end, they're all going to, all or many will come back. Oh, this would be good news. That's it. That's all. And then he goes and changes gears. So he has hope. I mean, if we time traveled Paul right now and say, Paul, do you have the same hope 2,000 years later when most Jews on the planet are not Christians? They're not. Most aren't. Most don't know the gospel at all. They think Christianity is a Gentile religion. They don't have anything to do with it. Yeah. Like this chapter reminds you of places where in the Old Testament, right, like in Exodus, where God hides his face from the people. Yeah, and the psalmist often will say things like that. Oh Lord, oh God, how long will you hide your face from me? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any questions come about this? Yeah. How would Paul know that God hardened their hearts? Uh-huh. Okay, on maybe two different extremes is not the right word. Maybe two different alternative ways of saying it. The typical Orthodox, I should have said that word. The typical response, maybe of the normal church Christian person would say, because the Spirit told him that, and he received a revelation from God, and he relayed exactly what God said. Maybe a standard New Testament scholar response is Paul saw an analogy that gave him hope in Deuteronomy and Isaiah, and said it must be just like that. Now, they're not antithetical. Those might be both true simultaneously. So what do you think? Do you want the microphone? Okay. hmm So God can use the rhetoric. It's hard sometimes reading through the rhetoric to determine what God's intention is. And I hear Katie saying that, yeah, it's sometimes difficult to navigate between what a human's saying or is that God saying it. Yeah, and in Christianity, most Christian thinkers, this is where it's right deep in the heart of issues of inspiration, is the degree to which, or the way in which God uses the text and or causes the text to be. The second question is, and the intent, the goal, the meaning that he's trying to convey. And that has, a few books have been written on that subject. I read about it all the time still to this day. I'm reading a book right now about the Canaan conquest. He reflects on all this stuff too. And that's right. You be human. How's the time? We're out of time. I'm kidding. So my view on that very much is that humans wrote it. I do not think any biblical text fell from heaven, you might metaphorically or literally, at all. Humans did it. I, the degree to which God inspired them to write, I'm not sure the degree to which to say that. And maybe afterwards we can chat about that. But I do assume very much is authoritative. Because in the Christian worldview, most Orthodox Christians forever said that the canon we received is authoritative. And so I listened to it very carefully. I want to hear what Paul's point is very carefully first before my opinion, anybody else's opinion. If Paul said it, okay, I'm listening very carefully because the church has handed this down to me. But then the question, of course, is the degree to which God told him these things. And it becomes, I'm with you that you didn't use the word problematic. You said maybe hard to something. For me, it's to people like us who study all of our lives, sometimes very problematic. So, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul sure seems to be, he thinks in his lifetime that Jesus is coming back, well, he's mistaken. Does that mean I should throw out everything Paul ever said? I mean, that seems silly to me. But he was mistaken. If he was mistaken, if that's a proper interpretation, which I think it is, well, that means God let him think something false. See, for a long time, that wasn't good with me, but it is now. It is now. Well, it has been for a long time, but it became really good with me that God would have let humans think false things. Well, why would he do that? Because either he doesn't care or their false beliefs get them to believe something else that is true or do something that's true. So I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. There's no Hebrew word for brain because the brain was worthless. Well, the brain's not worthless. We have a word for brain. I mean, we know what is important, but God didn't correct their physiology. He let them think something false. He thought there was a flat disc on pillars, and there's water above the sky. No, there's not. We've been up there. I mean, he let them think something false. I mean, I go down a laundry list of things they thought were false, but that doesn't mean everything is dismissed. It just means, but that's why this is a very good question, a complex question to me. At least to me it is. To me it is. Because, and I'll move on, because of the text. That's very important to understand because the conversation, I mean, even everything I just said right now in certain circumstances mean David's this or he's fired versus I'm not coming to the text with a presupposition. I'm reading it so closely. I'm going to ask the question, what you did, well, then what do we do with? What do we do with? Because I'm going to the text. And I'm fine, as you've heard me say many times, I don't know, I'm not sure. Like he doesn't, I mean, if you know, great, tell me. But I'd rather wrestle with it than I would dismiss it. And I don't dismiss it. Nor do I hopefully not terribly naive either. But that's all I'll say on that for now, unless you have any other questions or comments. Diane does. Diane, you want to hit a microphone? Do anything? Nope. Okay. I feel nope. Anything else? Question or comments? All right, we got a few minutes. Let's keep going. You want to? Romans 12.
I've got a question about
So close.
the assertion that the Jews have heard the gospel,
Okay. Question about the assertion that the Jews have heard the gospel. Yep.
and just accepting that, does that then apply to those all around us today that can see God's hand in whatever creation?
All right. Good question. So does that apply to us today and all people, they see God's hand in creation?
Because he referred to their Bible, in advancing that theory that they'd all heard it. He referred to the
So what about my neighbor who seems clueless? Because Paul seems to reference certain Old Testament texts where they were aware. What about my neighbor? That's a good question. I think right here Paul's not talking about your proverbial neighbor. I think your neighbor, unless your neighbor's a Jew, is your neighbor a Jew? Okay, so your neighbor's a Gentile. Then we go back to Romans chapter 1. Paul thinks Gentiles, and you remember in first century, human being walking around through Tarsus and Philippi and Ephesus and Rome and wherever. We haven't been to Rome just yet, but maybe in his lifetime. But he's thinking of fellow Gentiles he knows. He says, these people, they love worshiping idols and all these other gods. Something in them tells them that there's a God above them. There's something that tells them. And instead of them saying, it must be a creator God who made all this, instead they worship the creature. So they know better. The conscience tells them something. They knew better. Would Paul say that about your neighbor? I don't know. I think so, but I don't know. But I think so. I think Paul would say, even your neighbor. I'd say, but Paul, he doesn't worship other gods. He doesn't have idols. Look in his life. Today it doesn't work that way. I mean, if you go to India, yes, but most of the Western world, people do not worship many gods. They don't have idols. They don't have altars to anybody. They don't. They're what we call now non-believers, or some are straight up atheists. And in Paul's day, I don't know if he'd ever met an atheist in his life. Everybody believed in the gods. That's some form. I mean, even certain philosophical schools, there's still a oneness, a monistic. I think he'd say, "What?" I think Paul would probably still say, "There's still no excuse." How does he walk around the earth and go, "Where'd this come from?" I think that's what he would say. And if I'd say, Paul, but now we believe in something that scientists tell us it would just be. It would take a while to have him to grasp. I still think he'd say, "Is I don't care how you think about it. The universe had to come from somewhere. Look around you." I think. Hopefully, I'm not misreading him in my image, but I think that's what he'd say. And in his time period, surely Paul didn't think every Jew who existed or Israelite existed had heard the gospel. I mean, surely not, right? Sure, unless he's crazy or naive. Does Paul really think every living Israelite in the around the year 80, 55 or 60 or whatever had heard the gospel? I mean, surely he would say, no. I mean, I haven't been to Egypt yet. Jews are everywhere. They're in Babylon, for crying out loud. I mean, not ancient Babylon. They're way over there. I haven't been there. The Christian missionaries haven't been there. I mean, this missionary unit, this mission just started. I mean, I haven't been over there. There's going to be Israelites all over the known world. They haven't heard the gospel. I don't think that's Paul's point. I think Paul's point is to the Jews who live in Rome and the people with whom he's had contact, there's no excuse for them. So I don't think Paul thinks all Jews have heard it. But if they do hear it, then he says, no excuse for you. No, Paul, I'm still searching. No, you're not. You just heard it and you don't want it. I'm sorry, that's the best I can. What are your thoughts on that?
We think of hearing the gospel now as asserting Christ lived and died and rose from the dead. And that was that covered in their view of the Messiah, the coming Messiah?
Good question. So today, when we think of the gospel, we think of the.
We've got something to deal with.
We've got we have background or content to the gospel of Jesus, who's the Messiah who died on the cross and rose from the dead. You're saying, did Jews think that or anticipate that? Because the Messiah had been promised. As far as we can tell, no. As far as we can tell, nobody in ancient Judaism expected at all a Messiah who would come and suffer and die and be raised from the dead. Zero. And how do we know that? Well, we don't know what every Jew believed ever, but the best way we can get at it is you look up every single text ever written by a Jew, all the way up to the time of Jesus, and you read every single one of them. That's what scholars do. And zero Jewish literature, zero Jewish authors ever say, we know that Messiah is coming to suffer. That also explains why in the first century when Jesus said these things, they don't have a clue. Like, why do you... That's what Peter tells them, Mark 8:30. Jesus, be quiet, dummy. So no, I don't think. In fact, the text they saw as messianic fulfillment Those are not the ones cited in the New Testament. So the most likely explanation most New Testament historians would say, and I find this very persuasive, I do, is that the earliest Jews who became Christians had genuine religious, I'll call religious experiences. Genuine, they experienced something that told them, A, Jesus was alive, either by physical meeting them or the first, second generation after the disciples told them in a spiritual experience, maybe at a church service, maybe somewhere else. They had a genuine religious experience that told them Jesus really was the Messiah. And two, he really was in the heavenly realms alive, which means he ascended. Not just he was alive somewhere, but he ascended, which means the proper response is to pray to him, worship to him, and so forth. Then they go, what do I do with that? Well, that starts with this sense of experience, and we find that all through the Paul's letters. That sense of I've been changed, I've been moved, there's experience. Now what do? I go back to my Bible, try to make sense of this. And in my Bible, I never read Isaiah 53 that way. A suffering servant, we never expected that to be a messianic. No one read it that way. But now I see it clear as day. It's been there all along. We said in Luke 24 when Jesus, the disciples go,